Charles II of Spain couldn't chew food properly due to his deformed jaw. His legs were so weak that he only learned to walk at the age of 8. By 35, he looked like a 70-year-old man with the mind of a 10-year-old child. When he died in 1700, he took with him not only his lineage, but the entire Spanish Empire in Europe. Charles wasn't an anomaly. He was the inevitable result of 11 consecutive generations of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces within the House of Habsburg. This is not a story about love or politics. It's about how European dynasties' obsession with keeping the blood pure turned their own descendants into living evidence of a catastrophic genetic experiment, destroying entire empires from the inside out. Doctors at the time called it royal melancholy. Today, we know it was something far more sinister. In 1477, when Maximilian I of Austria married Mary of Burgundy, he wasn't just uniting the hearts. He was writing the operating manual that would destroy Europe over the next 3 centuries. The formula was simple: marry within the family to keep territories, titles, and treasures concentrated. What began as a political strategy turned into the deadliest tradition in European history. The Habsburgs were the pioneers. Belligerent, Ali, the Felix Austrian noob, let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria. Mary became more than a motto. It was a genetic death sentence. While other nations expanded territories through battle, the Habsburgs conquered through wedding ceremonies. Each marriage was a territorial annexation, each birth an imperial expansion. Philip I of Spain married Joanna of Castile, his distant cousin. Their son, Charles V, ruled an empire on which the sun never set: Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas. The success was undeniable, and the strategy seemed flawless. But by the second generation, the signs were already there. Joanna of Castile was called the Mad, displaying erratic behavior that we now recognize as possible symptoms of hereditary neurological disorders. The dynastic obsession had found its magic formula. Now it was just a matter of time before the true cost of that magic would be revealed. What began as strategic marriages between distant cousins evolved into something that would make the Egyptian pharaoh seem conservative. In 1570, when Anna of Austria married her own uncle, Philip II of Spain, Europe didn't just applaud, it considered it a brilliant diplomatic move. Anna was 21, Philip was 43. She was his brother's daughter. For the Habsburgs, this was just another Tuesday. The family trees of Europe's royal houses turned into vicious circles. Philip IV of Spain married Mariana of Austria, his own niece, the daughter of his younger brother. The French King Louis XIV, who was supposed to represent a different bloodline, was genetically closer to his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, than many biological siblings are to each other. Court mathematicians kept meticulous records of these unions, not of consanguinity, but of territorial inheritances. Each wedding was celebrated with week-long feasts, while royal doctors developed a euphemistic vocabulary to describe the peculiarities starting to appear in the offspring: hereditary melancholy, delicate constitution, introspective, temperament, elegant terms to mask what was really happening in the royal nurseries. The system had become self-sustaining. European royal families no longer married for political strategy. They married because there was no one left outside the family considered suitable for their blood. Purity had become a genetic prison. And in the palaces of Madrid, Vienna, and Versailles, the consequences were already being born. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661 as living proof that genetic mass spares no one, not even kings. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254 higher than that of children born to biological siblings. 11 generations of intra-Habsburg marriages had produced not an emperor, but a walking medical catalog of genetic defects. The famous Habsburg jaw, that protruding lower mandible seen in all official portraits, had developed into a deformity so severe that Charles couldn't chew properly or speak clearly. His legs were so frail he needed support to stand until he was 8 years old. At age 4, he was still dressed in girls' clothing because the court deemed he lacked enough masculine vigor for boys' garments. But Charles wasn't an isolated case. Leopold I of Austria, his cousin and brother-in-law, had the same jaw deformity. Maria Antonia of Austria, who became Electress of Bavaria, was described by ambassadors as having a melancholic appearance, a delicate constitution, diplomatic language for visible physical defects. Official portraits of the time became exercises in artistic concealment, strategic profiles, hands placed to cover jaws, postures designed to disguise coordination issues. Royal doctors developed increasingly elaborate treatments for conditions they couldn't name. Therapeutic bloodletting multiplied, fortifying elixirs grew more complex, and special diets became more restrictive. Nothing worked because they were treating symptoms of a problem that the royalty themselves had created and were consciously continuing to perpetuate. The royal body had become irrefutable evidence that blood purity was, quite literally, a death sentence. While Charles II stumbled through the halls of the royal palace in Madrid, struggling to form coherent sentences, official Spanish propaganda proclaimed him Charles the Bewitched, Catholic king by the grace of God. The European monarchy's PR machine had become a specialist in turning genetic tragedies into divine mysteries. Spanish court protocol forbade any mention of the king's indispositions in official documents. Foreign ambassadors were instructed to describe Charles as having a delicate constitution, but a brilliant mind in their diplomatic correspondence. When the King of Prussia asked directly about the rumors of Charles's mental incapacity, the Spanish ambassador replied that His Majesty was temporarily affected by supernatural influences. The Catholic Church became an active accomplice in this denial. Court priests attributed the king's deformities and mental deficiencies to the burden of divine responsibility or the sacred mark of heavenly election. When Charles II had seizures during a public mass, official chroniclers recorded it as a religious ecstasy. His speech difficulties were documented as deep mystical contemplation. Louis XIV's France faced similar dilemmas with his own cousin, Louis the Grand Dauphin, whose melancholy episodes were officially described as periods of intense philosophical reflection. The European courts had invented an entire vocabulary to deny what everyone could see. Their dynasties were literally decaying genetically. Doctors who dared to suggest alternative treatments or question the marriage traditions were discreetly reassigned to distant posts. Denial was no longer just a political strategy, it had become a matter of dynastic survival. On November 1, 1700, when Charles II finally died at the age of 38, his autopsy revealed what 3 centuries of inbreeding had produced. Royal physician Geronimo de la Fuente Pirola recorded in his confidential report, His Majesty did not have a single drop of blood, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines putrid and gangrenous, he had only 1 testicle, black as coal. The document, kept under strict secrecy for decades, described a body that barely functioned as a living organism. Charles's brain was full of water, his kidneys completely destroyed, and his liver reduced to fragments. These weren't just defective organs, they were medical evidence that generations of genetic manipulation had produced a human being genetically unviable. But Charles wasn't the only one subjected to such posthumous revelations. When Maria Theresa of Spain, wife of Louis XIV, died in 1683, French doctors documented similar internal deformities. Her uterus had an anomalous configuration, explaining her multiple failed pregnancies. Of the 6 children she had with Louis XIV, only 1 survived infancy, and he showed the same developmental issues as his Habsburg relatives. Leopold I of Austria, Charles II's cousin and contemporary, underwent a similar autopsy in 1705. Viennese doctors found multiple malformations that explained his premature death at 64, considered young for emperors of the time. His reproductive organs were underdeveloped, his bones abnormally fragile, and his digestive system constantly inflamed. Royal autopsies became state secrets, locked away in medical archives that would remain hidden for centuries. But for the few doctors who had access, the conclusion was inescapable. The European dynasties had committed systematic genetic suicide. The death of Charles II without an heir in 1700 triggered the W.R. of Spanish succession, but the true collapse had begun decades earlier in the royal nurseries. With his death, the direct line of the Spanish Habsburgs came to an end, not due to political chance, but because of biological inevitability. 300 years of pure blood had produced a genetically sterile lineage. The numbers didn't lie. Of the 34 documented Habsburg marriages from 1450 to 1700, 23 were between first or second-degree relatives. The infant mortality rate in the Spanish royal family was 78%, compared to 20% in the general population. Of the children who survived, 60% had severe physical or mental disabilities. The most powerful dynasty in Europe had become a failed genetic experiment on a continental scale. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, didn't just redistribute European territories, it officially marked the end of consanguineous marriage as an imperial strategy. Faced with the evidence of the Habsburg collapse, European powers quietly began to seek marital alliances outside their immediate family circles. Today, geneticists estimate that Charles II of Spain had the same level of genetic diversity as the child of two biological siblings. Modern studies of royal mummies reveal patterns of genetic mutation that confirm the deformities. Mental deficiencies and sterility were not supernatural curses, they were mathematical consequences of systematic genetic manipulation. DNA does not honor tradition, and when entire empires choose to defy basic biology in the name of dynastic purity, nature itself ensures the final verdict. Charles II was merely the last chapter in an experiment that turned palaces into genetic laboratories and kings into test subjects of their own hereditary obsessions. Europe learned late that some prices for purity are simply too high, even for emperors.